His was the only boat to arrive.
I think maybe it was a cow. I don't know.
There's the thank you letter from Lyndon Johnson.
There was even a monorail at one point to the east of us.
Plus, everybody forgets about pirates.
This is the coolest field trip I have ever been on.
I don't know, but I've been told, keep on dancing, won't ever get old.
Hello and welcome to the Long Island History Project, the podcast that brings you stories and interviews with people passionate about Long Island history. You can hear them all at longislandhistoryproject.org. My name is Chris Kretz, and I'm your host. And our opening music is courtesy of the Homegrown String Band. You know, I have no source for this, but I would bet you that back in the day there was a famous joke that went around the theater circuit that went like this. How do you get to Jones Beach Marine Theater? And then there would be two punchlines, either practice, 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 or Guy Lombardo's Speedboat. We have reached the final act of our inadvertent Freeport trilogy. If you've been listening, you heard the life story of jazzman Freeport native Chubby Jackson and his rise to prominence in the world of jazz and big bands and everything that came after. And then we had the Freeport murder mystery of 1914, a darker tale of a woman shot and killed in a doctor's office on Merrick Road. Newspapers had a field day. But now for the finale, we are moving on into mid-century America. We've got a star-studded cast. This is a story that involves Robert Moses and Louis Armstrong, Guy Lombardo, the Von Trapp family singers, Rodgers and Hammerstein, and most importantly, a young child actor who remembered it all and went back to document it. Stay tuned to the end of the interview where you'll get a preview of his work. But for now, please put your hands together for today's very special guest.
Hi, I'm Richard Beattie, and go by Richard Arnold Beattie as was my stage name, Actors Equity. I was a Long Island native. Well, I was born in Brooklyn, but I started in media at Jones Beach Theater as a child actor, and that's why I was so passionate about doing this project. And now I've had a long career in media. I'm a journalist, and I am a singer-songwriter. I do a lot of things in all kinds of media. So it's good. I live in Colorado nowadays, and I get back to Long Island, and it's always like a homecoming. I always love coming back.
Great. And we thank you for spending time with us tonight. We're on Libsyn Connect, and we'll mention that, do you consider Oakdale your hometown?
Yeah, pretty much. I spent most of my childhood there and my young adulthood, and so Oakdale. Yeah, and I know you've done some great work on Oakdale. I'm really anxious to read your book on Oakdale because it's such a fascinating place. We lived in what was known as the barn of the Christopher Robert estate.
It's interesting, and I change my mind every couple of months what the most fascinating part of Long Island, and you are the third in a series of accidental Freeport-based episodes. We're going to be talking about your project and Broadway and the Jones Beach Theater, which a lot of people nowadays will know from the rock concerts and have been there, which is Freeport adjacent, and we'll bring in the other connection will be the first family of Freeport, the Lombardo family. But so the project we're talking about is, how do you bill it? Is it audio documentary, or what's in your mind? How do you frame it?
I'm calling it an audio documentary. The main purpose is to be an audio book, and it will be also a printed book too. So we're looking at publishing the book of Jones Beach, From Broadway to Jones Beach.
Do you want to start with the location of the Jones Beach Theater, which is technically, what do they call it, Zacks Bay?
Yeah, on Zacks Bay. It's on the bay side of Jones Beach, and it's right near that tunnel. I don't know which parking lot anymore it is, but it's. I guess it would be technically, you would be northeast of the water tower. How's that?
Yes, and I printed out a picture myself. So if you're in the upper seats there, you can see it pretty much probably from anywhere. If you look to your right as you're sitting, you can see the tower and the Atlantic Ocean from
Yeah,
this.
just a beautiful place. And I open up the series with how Robert Moses, and there's a guy who is he's either glorified or vilified. It's and and probably rightfully so for both, but a genius. And he's on this sandbar, which is what Jones Beach was at the time, and this is the late 20s, and he's looking out at everything. He's with a bunch of suits. He was just newly appointed the Long Island State Park Commissioner at that point, and everybody's asking where are things going to go? What was your vision here? So he makes everybody go back to their cars, and they get paper. Whether it's napkins or whatever they had in the car. He starts drawing where things are going to go, and he was from what people say, as legend has it, he was pretty much correct that everything was in. Here we are saying where the Jones Beach Theater was. He knew where it was before it was there.
Before it was even built. Right. And he had a vision of a whole entertainment complex with tennis courts and venues.
Yeah, and that's the whole thing about Robert Moses. He built these magical places, and then he's known, of course, for dividing neighborhoods and displacing people, and never drove a car.
Let's set the stage a little bit. So this structure we're talking about, the vision of Moses in the late 20s, Jones Beach opens, and I think you mentioned there was some kind of wooden structure on Zach's Bay for a while.
Right, which was actually the work project for the Depression, the Relief Project, and they put this thing up, and it was mainly for water shows and water ballet, because it was kind of a rectangular piece. If you've seen some of those pictures, and it was by 1950 or 1948 or so, they had to raise it because it was probably had rats and the water rats and stuff like that. It was just not sustainable, that building. So Moses then builds this amphitheater to seat 8,200 seats, and the way he saw it, he was trying to woo La Scala in Italy over to do summer. That would be their summer home for the opera school, and that was how he had seen it. I was reading in a trade magazine. I think it was either a lighting or it was something for stagehands, but it was equipment for theater, and they said only Robert Moses could figure out to have a lagoon about an eighth of a mile away from the crowd and have that main stage.
To my mind, and this is maybe more for the modern audience, and not to belittle the experience, but the closest I think I can say I've experienced is the shows you see at Disney World. And there's one of them, I forget which land, but it's in the water. There's a lagoon there. So the stadium is, you said, about an eighth of the mile. So even if you're in the front row, you're pretty far from from the stage.
You're far away from the sun. And a little side note on that, we had to record everything that was staged on the main stage. Um, Everything on the forestage, there were mics lined up. There were a dozen mics that were lined up. It wasn't like Jesus Christ Superstar, where they were able to do the mics out of snakes, or whatever. However they did that, in modern Broadway. But these were actual mics on stands, like Shure SM58s.
And when you say forestage, just for us non-professionals, is that closer to the audience, or is the forestage?
Yes.
Okay, gotcha.
Yeah. So what they did is that Lombardo said, "Let's put an orchestra pit in, like a Broadway theater, and then let's have a forestage behind that." And the forestage ran the parameter of that lengthy. It was almost like a boardwalk. That's what the forestage was. It was built like a boardwalk.
So Moses builds this mid-50s, and I think the opera idea falls through. But was there What do you think was the impetus to say the people of Jones Beach need to see Broadway after a day in the ocean?
Well, I think when you look at 1953, they are talking to Mike Todd about doing shows there, and he did shows for 2 years. I think the elements really kind of ruined him for it. By that time, he was looking at Cinescope, and he was ready to go to Hollywood because he had a vision of film. It was probably good prep for him because it was like almost like doing location work, I think. And he did A Night in Venice, which was Strauss waltzes and a bunch of classical music and classical singers. And then he gave up on it the second year because I think he probably lost his shirt. Because, this wasn't just a figurehead type of producer. These guys invested in the productions. And so Long Island State Park Commission partnered with Michael Todd. They partnered with the Lombardo brothers. It was an entrepreneurial venture. It wasn't just a figurehead.
Right. I would imagine Moses is not doing anything pro bono, or he's got in Zion.
No, that's right. I mean, he's still got his toll booth going on in Northern State, and years after he paid for it. So so that's no, he's not doing anything pro bono.
So Michael Todd, so he was the first stab at this, and so were the Lombardos the successor then? They were brought in to produce, or?
Yeah, well, GCL was Guy, Carmen, and Lebert, all Lombardo brothers. They also had Victor, was another brother who played in the band, but they were entrepreneurial, from the very start when they got to the United States from Canada, and their music, of course, has that schmaltzy feel, but it also has the soundtrack. When you listen to like the Little Rascals or anything else, when you hear the soundtrack of the 1920s, it's pretty much the Lombardo band. Early sweet jazz was Lombardo's.
It's amazing the longevity, when you take the perspective of the Lombardos started in Canada in the 20s, in the height of the jazz age, knew Louis Armstrong early, and we'll get back to him and the connection. But so where would you put him when he became involved with this Jones Beach Theater? He's still at the height of his fame, would you say?
Well, probably the height of his fame, probably on the beginning of the downslope. And you have to think about this longevity and the big bands. And I heard an interview, and I'm using it for one of the shows, where Lombardo talks about how durable the big band music was, and it was. But he said the reason why there's only a few of the touring bands with the leaders still part of it is because you had two who were killed in the war. You had Glenn Miller and was Glenn? Yeah, Glenn Miller was.
Glenn Miller went down. Yeah.
Yeah, he went down, and he said because because of death is the reason why. We always hear those things, and of course, you've had some really good jazz people on, well, especially your first Freeport show.
Yep.
And they talk about the big bands, and you figured that they were on the road so much of the time. What was it? 9 months to 12 months a year, they're on the road, and they were in cars for the most part. So there were a lot of car accidents. A lot of players were killed, during the 40s in car accidents because they were trying to make the next gig. And Lombardo never spared an expense and really took care of his band. And I called this at first, I would call it homestand, because Lombardo figured out a way for his band to work. And many of them were in the pit orchestra of almost every show. They were working musicians, but they got a chance to spend time with their family all summer long. That 10 weeks was a godsend for a lot of these players, including the Lombardo family.
Yeah, that's actually a very canny move when you think of basically mid-50s through the 60s and 70s. I would imagine the audience for big bands was dwindling, and yet he found this venue where he could plug them in, and you were saying have a going gig for the summers.
Yeah, and as I said, and including him, and of course he had the East Point House, which was a restaurant, which I don't know how well it did. I mean, I look at some of the advertisements in the Jones Beach programs. By the way, I have bought back programs from Jones Beach, which are fascinating, Long Island history. But Robert Moses was wooing Lombardo in 1929. He invites the Lombardo brothers to Jones Beach to meet, and he's talking about this theater that he had in mind for where Zach's Bay was. And then the Lombardos at this point are still in Chicago, but they're wanting to come to New York. So they get this long-term gig at the Roosevelt Hotel, which is pretty famous. It was a pretty famous run. They did that for many, many years. In fact, I think even part of the years at Jones Beach, they continued that gig. But I understand during the tour that the Lombardo was on back in '53 or '54 that there were long distance calls from Robert Moses in many of the places that Lombardos were booked. And, Robert Moses was persistent.
And so I've got a list of the shows, and we'll link to this. You mentioned The Night in Venice, which it sounds like was not much of a success. What do you think was the first big hit that they brought in there?
From what I read about, I read that Arabian Nights was a hit. And this was an original. They started off thinking that they were going to be doing original shows, and from what I understand, Lombardo and John Jacob Loeb, who is most famously linked to writing the song "Rosie the Riveter" in World War II. But they were a partnership for a long time. I think he wrote like Coquette and some of the classic Carmen Lombardo songs. And it seems that the Lombardos, they wanted Carmen to kind of take that next step, which would have been musical theater and Broadway theater. I don't, when you look at the storylines and you read some of the reviews, they said they talk about all the things that were going on in the theater. The dancers, the swimmers, the boats, all of these things going on in the theater, and the music is pretty good. And then they said, so who needs a storyline?
And just again, we'll run through just some of the things. But when you talk about the spectacle of it, Showboat, which was soon after, they actually had a showboat, right? So
right. And as you heard, the wonderful that was amazing to me to find this recording of the broadcast from Mutual Broadcasting of this opening, and having Oscar Hammerstein, who Showboat was, of course, he's working with Richard Rodgers at this point. That certainly was an old Oscar Hammerstein musical with P.G. Woodhouse throwaways from other shows that were in it. But they had this Showboat, and Oscar Hammerstein speaks at this opening night, and he's talking about how the theater, even with this close scale model to what the Showboat was like, theater is still about imagination.
Yeah, and I've not done the research you have, but just there was a show called Song of Norway where they had an iceberg floating into the bay and a Viking ship.
Oh yeah, yeah, it's pretty. Song of Norway. I'm looking at the programs here.
Paradise Island, was there a waterfall somehow?
Paradise Island was another Carmen Lombardo show.
So an original.
Yes. Then they had Hit the Deck, which was a kind of a flop on Broadway, but it was all these veterans, and you think about Levittown and you think about Long Island. They had this Navy-oriented musical, which I think only lasted maybe a half a year on Broadway, and they brought that in, and in what a setting for that to be in. It looks stunning. And I noticed in the program they had, they were giving credit to Evan Rude Motors, so, and, any Long Island boy knows, wow, I know what an Evan Rude is.
And just to get back to the lagoon aspect, we bring the Lombardos back a little. I think he would arrive on his speedboat from Freeport. That was like a habit of his, make a grand entrance.
It wasn't just a habit. It was part of the show. It was the opening ceremony. I think I saw some sort of commentary on Jones Beach, and there was some cable TV show or something like that. And I heard the guy commenting. He said that Lombardo tried to figure out a way to get into the show every night. Like it was like some sort of Alfred Hitchcock thing or something like that, a cameo. But Lombardo had the tempo, which incidentally is housed in Coon Rapids, Minnesota now.
And that was his speedboat.
It was his cabin cruiser. That was his cabin cruiser. He had the Tempo 2, which was a speedboat. And that was used in the show quite often. Lombardo usually wasn't in the speedboat during the show. Like they had the Nazis chasing the Von Trapps through this with the Lombardo Tempo classic 20s and 30s speedboat, which is a mahogany, a beautiful, beautiful boat. And with the Nazi flag behind it too, So
that was part of the show. They would like circle the stage in the boats, chasing each other.
Yeah, yeah. But Lombardo always came out, started the show. It was like a baseball game sometimes. Being at a stadium every night, I felt very akin to the Mets.
Okay, I like that.
Lombardo would come out off of the speedboat and conduct the national anthem, hand the baton over to the conductor, the music director, and then he was off until the end of the show where they did their set in the Schaefer Dance Tent. And Robert Moses had a box at the Jones Beach Marine Theater, and they're right next to Guy Lombardo's box, and it was very very interesting. You never knew who was going to be in the box. You could see Louis Armstrong there one night in early 1970 or early summer 1970, and then you would see as Ty Lemley, the guitarist for the Lombardo band, says, I turn around and there is Perry Como in the in the box seats, and Ethel Merman. Jones Beach was the place to be. It was almost like going to Forest Hills during the U.S. Open.
Sure. This is a tangent maybe, but in terms of Broadway history, and it's a little I know, but when you talk about spectacles of Broadway and Andrew Lloyd Webber and chandeliers coming down in the theater and Miss Saigon with the helicopter. Do you think this chapter of Broadway history, did they not consider this Jones Beach Theater and its spectacle, and it sounds like some pretty innovative and huge productions, do you think they count that technically as part of Broadway history? And because I don't see it talked about much, and I might not be looking in the right place.
Yeah, and you don't, and I don't know why, and I don't know if that's because of Guy Lombardo and there's maybe a stigma there, or that here's the the King of Schmaltz, it's kind of like Lawrence Welk, I wonder why it is. I understand the early shows, but when they started doing these revival shows, we always felt, for those 3 years that I was there, that it was a close cousin to Broadway, and Playbill and all of the theater critics and everybody else had given it, during its time, its due. It's later that, aside from the big section that Newsday did, and I think that's about 25 years ago, maybe it was 20 years ago, that they did a whole section on when Broadway came to Long Island. And they talk about that, and they talk about Westbury Music Fair. And I think during its time, it really did receive its due. Where else could you actually see a Broadway show with Broadway stars? That's one reason why I think I decided I would take some of the things that the stars of those shows had done on Broadway before and after. When you look at the dean of stage managers on Broadway, Mortimer Halpern, those are Broadway people, and they were there every summer. So it was, maybe it was because it was summer. I mean, there were some people that would look at it as summer stock. It's way beyond. I was at Gateway Playhouse for a year in 1969 as a young child actor, and that was summer stock. So
Yeah, and that's a perfect segue. We want to bring you on stage since we've reached that point to get you warmed up, or just to test you. Can you name all the Von Trapp children?
I can. The youngest daughter was Gretel. Then there was Marta. Then there was Brigida, Louisa. There was certainly Kurt, who I played for 2 years there. There was Friedrich, the older brother. And then there was Liesel, the 16 going on 17. There's the 7.
Very good. So you mentioned your time at the Gateway, but so were you destined for the stage? And you performed with your 2 siblings. So what got the Beattie family into Broadway, do you think?
Yeah, a few things. I probably was the most focused on doing that out of the family. We did sing as a family, and my brother and sister, we're all right in a row as far as age group goes. We had a friend who lived in Oakdale by the name of Penny Burton, and she was in Gypsy. She played the young baby June, and we used to hang out with these people, and we did our music lessons. We did a lot of different things for just local Oakdale stuff or whatever. We went to a talent show for. They didn't have one at our parish at St. John Nepomucene. This is a Roman Catholic church, but they did have it at St. Mary's in East Islip, and so we auditioned for that. They had us do the talent show. We won first place, and then we didn't. It's like playoffs. You go off to the next thing. You have a regional thing. It was all Suffolk County. Well, we won first place for that one. Then they had a final, all Long Island, type of, and we won that, and we kept on going, and for a long time we did CYO, we played in nursing homes, and we did all these kind of things. We actually begged my parents to audition for Gateway, and a lot of actors in training at the time in the 60s. It was run by the Pomerantz family, and then the Sheldons, I believe, were the second family. And so we were there that whole summer. Then my Scottish grandfather passed away in November of 69. And it was pretty devastating for our whole family. And my mother saw this thing about that Jones Beach and Guy Lombardo was going to be doing Sound of Music in 1970. And so the auditions were in February. So my mother writes a little note to GCL Productions, and they said, yeah, come on in for the audition. And we got there's thousands of kids, and you figured we didn't have a chance, right? I mean, there's thousands of kids, and they're looking for 7 to 9 kids because they had to have understudies too. And I think because we were 3 kids from the same family, they thought, boy, this is like our dream,
You're halfway there already.
Yeah, this is an easy casting thing for us. And we had this medley that we did. It was from Oliver, and we started off with "Food, Glorious Food," and they stopped us in the middle. And John Fernley, the director, who was a dear friend for many, many years, he's since gone. I said to him, I said, sir, we have 2 more numbers to do, which everybody kind of gasped. But he was like, just hang out for a while. I think you'll be happy with the results.
So I'm looking at I'm as we talk, I'm looking at the aerial again. So what are your memories of? I don't know if you remember the very first time you were shipped out to the stage. But what's your memory of being on that space, facing the audience, being on that floating? Did it float, or I guess when you're on the main stage, it was pretty secure?
Well, it's really interesting because one of the other things I did not talk about was that the Von Trapp's home, their mansion, actually came in on a barge. It was in that lagoon, so it was a boat, and so it doesn't really move or anything. You're pretty solid on there, and they have their own set of microphones on that. You learn the choreography and you learn how to really use a mic as far as where you say your lines, and you've got your marks, and you got all of those things, and so opening night was my 11-year-old birthday, July 1st, 1970, and it was totally magical to be part of that and be part of that cast. They all sang happy birthday, and as Connie Towers says, she goes, I bet that's still your most favorite birthday, and I don't want to commit to that because I have my own family now, and they've thrown some really good birthday parties for me.
But it's up there.
But it is up there, yeah, that's right.
Well, one thing that I'm picking up from the episodes I've heard, this is really, you do interview former cast members, and it really sounds like a bond, and this might be typical of Broadway productions, hopefully. But, like you're mentioning Connie Towers, who was Maria, right, in the performance, and
Yeah.
she performed in other roles. But it sounds like, especially with you children, do you feel the older actors looked out for you, or were they welcoming to a newcomer like you, or?
Yeah, and I think I even say it in the interview with Connie that it's like having team captains almost that were watching out for everybody.
Yeah, and what's fascinating to me, I like how history overlaps. So like you were 12, 13, and you were interacting with a generation a little bit on their back end at least. But, people had grown up through the 20s. Like, I don't know if you remember stories or would they relate anything to you as a child, but it's interesting that, moving into the 70s and everything that generation kind of epitomizes, and yet hanging out with people, Rodgers and Hammerstein in the 50s and late 40s kind of attitudes. I don't know. Anything spark you about that overlap of generations in your?
Well, it always does. I really think talk about being born at the right time and being in the right place at the right time, to have those legacies and those legacy writers. And I always appreciated musical theater. I always appreciated Broadway. I appreciate jazz. I appreciate a lot of music, and being a singer, I felt that we had the best of the best that we learned from. And it was, when I left Jones Beach, my voice had changed by then. And I'm going out, and John Fernley, who was one of the key directors for Rodgers and Hammerstein, was the original casting director for The King and I. And he was a part of that association for a long time. But he came looking for me, knowing that I wound up getting bad reviews because my voice changed from the New York Times. I mean, what kid can say that when my voice changed, I did it in front of 8,200 people, and in front of the New York Times and Variety.
Well, there is so much depth to this story, and I don't want to give it all away because we want people to follow along. Can you talk a little bit about the process? What I loved is it turns out Lombardo was a dedicated audiophile, and he was recording.
Yeah, I didn't know this because I had thought that everything that we recorded on the main stage was recorded in Manhattan at the iconic Columbia, what they call the church, the studios, the Columbia Studios in Manhattan. I think it's on 23rd Street or something along that line. But we would record every year in this place where Duke Ellington and Billie Holiday recorded their iconic songs. Louis Armstrong and the Lombardos, they recorded everything that was on the main stage there at this studio. And I thought when Liz Ann Lombardo told me that she had tapes, she had the original tapes I thought that's what she was talking about. And what I found out is that Lebert Lombardo, the trumpet player and the brother of Guy, uh, he was an audiophile. He's also a film. Uh, he was a film geek as well. He would film everything, but the films didn't survive. But all these tapes did, of every single show from 1954 to 1977.
So it's the sound of the stage at Jones Beach.
Yeah, she sends me boxes of tapes, and I'm realizing these are entire shows, and including the only recordings of Louis Armstrong in 1966 in Mardi Gras.
A show that he did. He came out for a summer and did that Mardi Gras performance, which we'll give a shout out to the Louis Armstrong Museum, and we can link to the pictures of that practice session of Louis and Guy in the heat of Jones Beach.
You need to warn them that there's topless pictures of Guy Lombardo in those pictures.
So we'll note that. But yeah, so I mean that's a treasure trove, especially to build an audio documentary around, to have that kind of access. I'm sure it must have been.
Well, not only that, but we've had this concept of why haven't there been full Broadway shows or just musical theater shows in this kind of audio world. I think there's one that I know of Julie Andrews and Ben Kingsley in The King and I. And that, I don't think it has the whole show. It has all the music from this show. But this has all the dialogue and everything else. The quality is pretty good. We're kind of coming up to the point where we're thinking these may have been copies, because there's some mono which I'm going to remaster as soon as they're from 1954. You can imagine they're falling apart. Their splices are coming out and everything else. But this is, we're preserving Long Island history.
Yeah, no, and so let's give us the big picture. So we're about a third of the way through. So walk us through the rest, just the rest of the episodes and what you hope to do after that, and the work with the Lombardo family. And
Right. The way things have been going, and it's been a little bit, I won't say frustrating, because I didn't even know I was going to have these. I have about 90% of the interviews done with people who are still with us. I have been able to get permissions for some other interviews, like John Cullum. John Cullum's still alive. His wife, Emily Frankel, just passed away recently. And so John was not available. When you think about John Cullum's probably the most iconic Broadway guy that we had. So I'm probably going to use just parts for the documentary of the tapes with these. And then I've been just collecting all these great stories. I think June Angela, who was on Electric Company and then played Tupton on Broadway in Jones Beach. We have an episode with her, and that's great because she was in South Pacific, and she's Asian, she's Japanese, and there's a great story about her coming to the Sound of Music auditions. And Arnold Spector, the managing director, saying, "Oh, Junie, dear, I need to explain to you, this is an Austrian family." And she said, "That's the first time I realized there was such a thing as typecasting."
yeah, and I've heard pieces of these, and again, I don't want to give the story away, but there are some great Broadway stories, stage mothers, and like we mentioned, Louis Armstrong. There's even more on him. So it is really, it's not just a Long Island history story. It is a Broadway story. It's your story. It's a great piece. So again, only 3 episodes in. I can't wait to hear the rest. Anything else? I'll link to things, but do you want anything for people listening in the moment? Where would you steer them to go to listen?
I would. I've been doing it as a podcast right now. I will probably have to get you some links once we have the publishing all figured out, and people can get the whole collection. We are also, as I said, as much as we can digitize and get a really nice product out there. I think this is like akin to radio theater, only it's musical theater, and that people would be very, very interested, especially people who are Broadway oriented and they want to pass this on to their kids, especially Long Islanders. I mean, when you know that, I mean, I still will go even in Denver, and I'll talk to people, and they will say, yeah, they remember Jones Beach Theater in Long Island. They remember going, whether they were tourists or whether they were Long Islanders or New Yorkers, and seeing those shows. And those are really special memories.
I think it was the first year that we did Sound of Music. One of the little girls said to me, I can't swim. And I said, don't worry. If you fall in the water, don't worry. I'll be right there. I'll get you. Well, one night we were on a little platform close to the orchestra, and we could hear the audience kind of rustling and talking. And I thought, what is it? And I turned around and looked in the water where the spotlight was hitting the water, and there was a shark. And I turned around to the little girl and I said, you know what? You're on your own.
There was a tunnel, right, that went from underneath the main stage to the front?
Yeah, there was a tunnel. It did go underneath. They had built the tunnel for Arabian Nights because they were moving elephants.
Oh, my gosh.
And then they just moved actors.
Oh, my goodness. And then we came on like with barges, right, as well?
Yeah, there were barges. There were the two stages in between. Now it's really just a rock concert venue.
Are the rock people on the, where the dressing room area was, that area? Or
no, they're on the main stage. What they did is that they got rid of the orchestra pit. They put seats in there. Oh. It now seats 16,000.
Oh my gosh.
I want to say thanks again to Richard Arnold Beattie. It was great talking to him, great hearing his audio journey unfold as he uncovers all of this Long Island history that he uncovered and lived through. Those clips you heard were Richard interviewing Connie Towers and June Angela from different episodes of From Broadway to Jones Beach, sharing their memories. From Broadway to Jones Beach is a 10-week broadcast, podcast, and audio publication from Sound Century Originals. It's running through Labor Day weekend, and you can find it on Spotify, and we will also have links to how to keep up with Richard and all the next phases of the project. You can find those links at longislandhistoryproject.org. And if you remember this version of Jones Beach Theater, if you were at any of these shows, if you remember the speedboats or the dancers or the waterfalls or the Viking ships, drop us a line. We can share it with Richard. I'm sure he'd love to hear it too. You can get in touch with us at longislandhistoryproject@gmail.com. And that does it for our episode. Our outro music is Capering by the Blue Dot Sessions, used under an Attribution 4.0 international license. Hope you're having a great summer, and as always, thank you for listening.